All right. Hi, welcome to Codementor Office Hours. My name is Wei Ting. I'm part of the team Codementor. Today, we're very excited to have our Codementor design and typography expert, Jason Pamental, with us today.
Hey there.
So, Jason is the author of Responsive Typography from O'Reilly, and today we'll be having an interactive discussions about responsive typography and how to implement web fonts for performance and polish. Jason, let's begin.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. And I know we've got a bunch of great questions that people had sent in, and so I thought what I'd do is start off with some slides from some of the talks that I've been giving about responsive typography at conferences like DrupalCon and Future of Web Design in London and Future Insights in Las Vegas, and I've kind of pulled out a bunch of the slides that I think are most relevant to the questions that people have been asking, and then after that, we'll, if that hopefully will sort of spark some discussion, and then we can just go straight into the questions that people have, or anything else that people want to look at and talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So you should be seeing the intro slide now, I hope. Let me know if that's the case.
Looks like it's coming up.
Okay, great. All right, so hopefully this will broadcast cleanly. So just make sure you let me know if you're having any trouble with it, because when I have this in this sort of presentation mode, it's hard for me to see some of the other stuff. I can see the chat window behind, but if I flip over to it, then you'll lose the slides. So why don't I get started? Okay, so who am I? Well, I've been working on the web since 1994, and have worked in a variety of capacities, both as creative lead and technical lead. And by technical lead, I mean like really doing .NET development and server management and infrastructure build-outs and all kinds of stuff. So design and technology has always been something I've done a lot together, and that really figures pretty heavily in the approach that I take with type. So I tinker with a lot of things, both on the web and off. I have an old car, and I rebuild carburetors and things like that. I walk my dog around the reservoir a lot, so if anybody ever follows Jay Pamental on Instagram, that's pretty much all you'll see are images from Drupal conferences and other web conferences and Turner Reservoir with my dog. So that's me. The company that I have now is with my wife. We've been working together for 3.5 years at a startup, and now with our own business for the last 1.5 years. And we provide web strategy and design consulting for a number of clients like Yale University, UCLA, and a few other higher education clients, as well as a bunch of high-tech companies in the Massachusetts and New England area. So I got really interested in web fonts because as a designer, it really opened up the world for me on the web in a way that wasn't present for the first 15 years or so. But one of the things that both web fonts and responsive design really helped uncover was that we're not really that honest with ourselves in a lot of ways about how we work on the web and what we tell our clients and what we can and can't do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about responsive typography, about things that aren't necessarily true and what we can do about them, and which things we can control and which things we can't, and talk about how to prototype this stuff in a way that will help you get the most out of web fonts, both from an aesthetic point of view, but also from a performance one. So web typography, I think, is an important qualifier because the things that we have to do on the web are different. It's not just understanding letter forms and what kind of a story they tell and what kind of a mood they bring to the design, but it's how do we get that to work in a way that doesn't make us all cry and want to rip them out because it just kills the experience of loading a page. So I think we have to accept that there's both design aesthetics and there's design and technology considerations. We can't necessarily stop calling it that because of all of these considerations. Furthermore, with responsive design, since our canvas is fluid and it's constantly getting bigger and smaller, we can't really rely upon our traditional fixed units of measurement. So we have to figure out ways to convey meaning without being completely reliant upon how those fixed relationships are between one thing and another, a heading and body copy, or a block quote, etc. And that reading on screens is only going to increase. I mean, one of the things that we have to remember is that Amazon has been selling more ebooks than print ones since 2011. So the reading experience is really critical that we get right, and it's something we have to think about in all of the web stuff that we work on, both apps and also in just regular web. So it's not the stuff that we don't know that's going to kill us, because I'm going to teach you all this stuff, and then you will know it. But it's the stuff that we ignore that really is going to trip us up and come back to bite us. So what do I mean by that? I mean stuff like 960 pixels. That was always a fantasy, and what we're looking at now is the New York Times homepage, and that actually was just redesigned and went from 960 pixel width down to about 980. So they really didn't actually do much to take advantage of the screen real estate that we all have, and they actually didn't do a whole lot to really take it into consideration. You're not seeing the homepage. It should be right in the middle of this slide. You're not seeing that graphic? Okay, it might be a slow refresh. I'll try and go a little slower with the slide transitions. Hopefully, Ronnie, you'll catch up. So this is another issue, and that's the one of pixel perfection. We can't really do that either. We never have been able to. It's always been very hit or miss. I mean, we can certainly try, and you can get it right most of the time, but it's kind of a fantasy, and it really doesn't belong here. We need to deliver great experiences that are appropriate for that particular platform. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, because it never will be from one size Android device to the next. So why are we even going to try? So that's another thing that we need to stop thinking about. And the third thing that I wanted to bring up is the notion of a page in the first place. Because when we're talking about content in a CMS, when a lot of the things that we're working on might be a long one-page scrolling site, it could be something in Drupal or WordPress or Joomla, could be in any number of other kinds of systems where we don't know what the content is going to be tomorrow. So no matter what we do to bring this stuff to life, we don't know the specifics of the actual content. We have to worry about the system that's going to display it. So one of the questions that we got was about widows, so leaving one word on the last line of a paragraph. You can't rely upon going in and putting a non-breaking space between the last two words, because you're not going to do that with every paragraph and every page, and the client's certainly not going to do it either. So we have to come up with other ways to make a system of great typography that helps convey all of this meaning and information in a sustainable way. So if we take away the things that we can't know about screen size, we can't know about device capabilities, we also can't know about concurrent activities, we can't know about depth of focus or even why they're here. So with all of these things that complicate the whole experience and our understanding of somebody getting our content, one of the few things that we can hang on to, that we can know about and can deal with in an effective way, is type. So when you take away the type, there's not really a whole lot to see. So hopefully this is refreshing quickly, but you've got the BBC News website here with no type on it, and you can see it's not really going to convey an awful lot until that type comes in. And when the screen gets smaller, that gets even more important. So now we're looking at this on an iOS simulator. This is the same website showing a bit of a story, but unfortunately, one of the things that we see here is the only way that we know this is the BBC is in the header bar actually saying that it's on bbc.com. Now, that's really unfortunate, because what they've given up is all of their own brand. They've brought the story to a screen in an appropriate manner, but what they haven't done is preserved their own identity through the process. And what this points out is that the only thing left to do that is the type that's on the screen. So if we look at this next screenshot, this is from the New Yorker magazine website. And it's a really great responsive design. And if you know the New Yorker at all, you'll recognize the typeface that they have for these sections immediately, because they've been using this typeface for decades. It's something that everybody knows, and it instantly conveys that this is the New Yorker. And so it's very powerful to be able to convey that much of an identity just through the shapes of the letters. But that's what we have to use when we're designing for very small screens, and that's increasingly how people are consuming this content, or at least how they're initially coming in contact with it. So we really want to try and keep that stuff in mind. So type really is one of the most important elements because it's one of the most prevalent on the screen in anything that we do. So I'm going to talk about 4 basic things that I sort of define as the heart of responsive typography. And I'm being very careful about using responsive typography because it's not the type that's responsive. That's a whole different issue, and it's a whole different technological nut that some people are looking at trying to crack, but it's the use of that type. So we want to talk about performance and make sure that you're only loading what you need and we're not blocking the page rendering. We want to make sure that it's progressive so that it works really well when the fonts are there or when they're not. We want to talk about proportions so that we can think about how best to set type on small screens versus large, because the scale changes are really quite different. And then a little bit about polish, because there are a lot of little details, and it was great to see some of these questions about things like widows and how to use open type features like ligatures to get really fine typography into your design and your web application, because that really is what will set things apart, especially when that's the only thing there to convey the true sense of what you're trying to get across on a small screen. So let's get into performance. Performance is not I used everything. That's not what typography is all about, but it's about loading what you need when you need it. So in thinking about typefaces versus fonts, you can think of the typeface as a family of styles of letters. The font is a specific weight and variant of that. So bold or bold italic or regular. And that technically corresponds to a file, but for the purposes of what we're doing on the web, those things all get loaded individually, and you have to make sure that you manage that loading process and only load the ones that you absolutely need. So I wanted to show you what tends to happen if you're not careful when you use some of these font services. So this is a screenshot from Typekit, which I'm a real fan, and they're better at this now than they used to be. But what used to happen is when you added something to use it in a font to use in your kit, when you're choosing typefaces to use on Typekit, it would add all of these weights and styles. If you look down the left-hand side of this graphic, all these little checkboxes, regular, italic, medium, that adds up to 450K for 2 different fonts. And that's really a whole lot to force somebody to download when the likelihood is you're only going to use maybe 4 weights and variants of one and maybe only 1 weight of the other. Because typically, for headings, you might only use 1 weight or style. And then for body copy, you might have regular, italic, bold, and bold italic. So when we do that and trim it back, it's only 120K. And that gets cached, so it's not something that has to get loaded on every page. And that really makes a drastic difference. I mean, I was talking with somebody on Twitter today whose experience internationally on very high latency connections was that web fonts, when they're not handled properly, can add minutes to the page load. And when we only have about 5 seconds before a lot of mobile users will bail, that's a complete failure. And the way the browsers are handling that now, they're not showing any content at all while we're waiting for these web fonts to load, and that's a real problem. But we can get around that, so that's what we want to make sure that we're doing. So that brings me to FOUT, or Flash of Unstyled Text, and this is another thing that sort of crosses the boundary between performance and progressive enhancement. But typically, what you'll see during the loading process is either a fallback font, like you'll see in the left, that's completely not in keeping with the site design, or you'll see nothing at all with some random underlines where the links should be. And that's because the browsers are taking the tack of not showing you anything, or at least waiting until 3 to 5 seconds have gone by before they're going to show anything if that web font hasn't loaded. And that's, again, a critical issue if you only have a few seconds before mobile users are going to start to leave. So what happens is you see nothing, and then a few seconds later, you see all the right typefaces come in, and the rest of the screen will draw. So what's happened there is not only have those web fonts held up showing the text content, in some cases they can even block rendering the rest of the page so that you don't even get some of the images either. So it's a huge issue, and when left unchecked, it can really ruin the experience of the site, especially on a slower connection. So we want to make sure that we use the tools that we have, and these tools have been around for a number of years. So we're going to talk about the web font loader that Google developed with Typekit. And the way that works is by using the web font loader, and that's either by default with Typekit, or you can look it up on the Google Fonts website, and they'll point you over to the place to find the code for it. It's just if you go to google.com/fonts, and you can look at the fonts that they have and load some, and then there'll be a link to how to use it, and you can get to the web font loader from there. And it injects these classes in the page, WF inactive during the loading process, and then WF active once those web fonts are loaded. And because we can rely upon those classes being present as long as JavaScript is working, we could add a line of CSS that during the loading process, when WF inactive is present, it loads typefaces that are only the fallback ones. And that's pretty fantastic because it gets your content on the screen right away without any of that delay. And then you can use that CSS class that's there in order to adjust font size, line height, and letter spacing in order to avoid jumpiness when the web font does actually load. And this has been around since 2010, so it's not something that's brand new. It's actually something that some of the the browser vendors are starting to build in so that you actually don't have to use an external JavaScript library. And that will make things even that much better. I know Chrome is working on it, but I don't think it's been actually officially released in any of the browsers yet. So I'm going to show you a quick example of how this all works by adjusting the fallback fonts during that loading process. So these are screenshots of a sample page that I made a while back, where this is what it should like with the web fonts fully loaded. And I'm going to go to this next one. Hopefully you saw things shift around a little bit. This is with no correction in the fallback font. So we've loaded the fallback of Georgia and Helvetica in place of the web fonts. And now in this one, we've adjusted the spacing ever so slightly so that you can see things lining up a little bit better, so that when the web font finally loads, things don't really shift around all that much. So you can see horizontal and vertical spacing is roughly the same. You get very little change in line wrap. Your navigation doesn't reflow. All the things that tend to be such a big problem with FOUT can be alleviated by this simple technique for working with the web font loader and tuning up your fallback fonts. So I wrote an article about that for fonts.com a few years ago, and all the code samples there, and it's also in my book that's just coming out now with O'Reilly. So that's progressive enhancement. This is another example, another aspect of that, where using the code from the Google Web Font Loader, this is actually loading it asynchronously, so it's not blocking the drawing of the page. It just issues the request. It doesn't wait for it, and then it will just load in the web font once it's present. I've also added a no-script block in order to load it via CSS in case JavaScript doesn't work. So that way you can be sure that you give the best possible experience to the browsers that can handle it, but you're not leaving anybody out in the cold. You can always serve those web fonts. And Typekit is the only platform that won't let you do this. All the rest of them will give you a CSS line to put in there, in addition to advanced methods that will allow you to load things through JavaScript. Okay, so proportion. This is another area that I've spent a lot of time with over the past year or so, and wrote an article for the Typecast blog a while back, and really spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how this proportion stuff would work well as screen sizes change. Because what I found was that while we have a known scale that's been around for many, many years in print design that works pretty well to set headings in relation to body copy, it doesn't really hold up very well when the screen size starts to change. So I wanted to be sure that we could address that in a meaningful way, and so I set about trying to make a different scale. And I spent some time on that, and I think it worked out pretty well. It gives people a good starting point to figure out how to set type on big screen and little, and just tie it into your media queries so that you can have things that look sort of pleasing and in proportion on small screens as well as large ones. So the link is here on the slides. It's in the book. You can find it on the Typecast blog. There's plenty of places to see it. And the whole scale is reproduced there. I'm just going to show you some of the examples of it. So we've got sorry, just can everybody still hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. And you still see the slides?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thanks. I just wanted to be sure. So here's an example of that same web page that has had the same scale applied for headings and body copy on the left and the right from large screen and small. And you'll see when you have that same proportion, it really looks a little ungainly, and you end up not seeing a whole lot of content. But on the smallest breakpoint, if we end up tweaking that scale a bit, we can still get something that conveys the meaning, the importance of the name of the site and the name of the page, the title of the page, but it gets so much more content on the screen. It has much better line wraps, and you can see that this really holds up for the integrity of the design much, much better. And all we did really was across these breakpoints start tweaking the size of the headings in relation to the body copy. We left the body copy alone, and that is one of the questions that came up. And I tend to leave the type size for the body at 100% so that the device manufacturer is really dictating what is a readable size type without my trying to second guess it. And I find that that works really well most of the time. So I will set that as my 1M, my one relative unit of type, and then headings will be some multiple of that. So on the smallest screen, it might be an H1 might be 2M or twice the size of the body copy, and on the desktop size, it might be 3M. That's all subject to tweaking, where every typeface is going to look a little bit different, but it's a good starting point. And I find that this sort of set of numbers seems to work pretty well. So if you go to this bit.ly link /JPRWT, that will take you to that article, and you can see the whole scale there and play around with it. There's a link for some sample code and stuff too. A few other things about measure and scale. I did mention about relative units. Be sure that you don't forget M's are really important, but it's not just for setting your type, it's also for your media queries. And the reason I bring that up is if you don't set your media queries with M's, if you stick with pixels, what will end up happening on some devices that have very high resolution screens, but they're a combination of both touch and pointer. So like various Samsung touchscreen laptops are a good example. You end up with your content at this tiny little stripe down the middle of the screen, and that's because it's a super high resolution screen and it's not respecting the sort of artificial constraints that have been imposed upon these devices like phones. Their true resolution is much greater than 320 pixels across, but that's what they report all the time. So by setting your breakpoints in M's, it actually will make everything render properly on all of these different devices, even though you're just picking an M equivalent of the pixel value. So play around with that if you can. I don't know if anybody has one of those devices, but if you have a chance to look at some different responsive sites that way, you'll be in for a real shock. So that's definitely worth checking out. A couple other things that I have on the slide here. Setting max widths on your paragraph tags will help keep your line lengths from getting really, really long. 38M might be a little bit narrow. You probably could go a little bit wider than that, but essentially what that does is it keeps your line length at a length that's comfortable to read and is not too hard for you to get back for your eye to follow back to the start of the next line. So that's just a basic little typographical design tip for you to take with you, and you can set that max width on a number of different elements in order to allow your design to scale, but have your type not get really hard to read. And the last thing on this slide is, don't use lorem ipsum text when you're working on your design. Grab some real copy from somewhere, because the word lengths and everything are just so uniform with lorem ipsum that you'll never get the true feeling of type as it's going to reflow when you have real stuff to work with. So here's another little step in the journey. Polish. I'm going to try and wrap up these slides. Polish is really just getting the fit and finish. It's getting all the nice little things that we can do. So if you look at the way these letters come together in the heading up top and the main title, A Whale of an Afflicted Tale, and see what happens when I activate the open type features, and you can see how everything tightened up. You get these beautiful little connectors between some of the letters. The F, F, and L come together as a single unit, a nice little connector between the C and the T. Everything kind of comes together and feels a little bit like more of a unit. And even the halfway to 19,000 leagues, you've got much nicer numerals here, and you've got a real fraction instead of a 1/2. So that stuff really sits together nicely. And that's all part and parcel of open type features. And if you're working with a typeface that supports it, the CSS is really easy, and you can then not have to worry about the fallback because it just goes back to normal characters. So there's really no downside to including that other than a slightly larger download. So you don't want to do it on everything, but it really does add a nice level of polish if it is available. Another little bit here with using columns in your CSS and a nice initial cap. Again, these are all nice little bits of CSS you can add into your page that don't really have a downside because if the browser doesn't support it, it just doesn't show. But this is using CSS columns in the middle, an initial cap in that first paragraph, and you can see when you look at it on a phone, everything scales down proportionally. It collapses from 2 columns to 1. The initial cap C scales down so that it stays in better proportion to the intro paragraph, and it doesn't look too ungainly on the small screen. So all those things are pretty standard bits of CSS that don't require too advanced a browser to support, and again, the fallback on those things is seamless. It just goes back to regular letters and no columns, and it works just fine. Another one of the questions that was asked about orphans, widows and orphans rather, so not wanting to leave a single word on the next line. So this is a little screenshot from our website, and you can see that as I bring the screen in here, we end up with just the world rather than world on the last line. And that's using a module called Typography. And that is a Django library that somebody adapted to make into a Drupal module. And there is also a plugin for WordPress that does it as well. And this does a bunch of little things, but one of the neat things is that it inserts a non-breaking space between the last 2 words in every paragraph. And that happens automatically, and it happens on the server side, which is really awesome. So it doesn't really matter if this is in a CMS. It's not something the administrator has to do at all. It's actually something that gets handled on the server side, so that when this page gets served to the end user, then it just automatically has all these little niceties in it, and it can handle a lot of character substitution. So you get regular, good curly quotes and apostrophes rather than the straight up and down hash marks and stuff like that. So that stuff's all really great. If you don't have access to, or you're not using one of these content management systems, you can also search for Widow Tamer on GitHub. Nathan Ford created that library, and it works really well in order to add this as a JavaScript plugin. It's a little jQuery plugin that allows you to define how many characters you want to have on the last line, and it will always make sure that you have at least that many that show up on this last line of text. So you can actually make sure that it's more than just 2 words. You might want to specify that there's 3 or 4. So it really, you can have a lot more finer control over it as long as you're okay with that being JavaScript and happening on the client side. But it does work really nicely. A lot of this stuff, I will also say, you can get if you go to my GitHub repository, and so just search for J Pamental on GitHub, and I have all of the sample code from the responsive design workshop that I teach, and there are several units in there on typography, so that you can look at all of that sample stuff and get a lot of this sample projects and code right out of that. So that's responsive typography on the web. It's making sure that we adapt. It's making sure that we're ready for what's going to come next. That little tidbit there about, you go back to the last Winter Olympics before this one that we just had, there was no iPad. You go back one more, there was no iPhone. And that's kind of alarming to think how much has changed just in 2 Olympic cycles. But that's what makes it so important for us to understand these basics and then really be able to work with type effectively in a meaningful and systematic way, so that as our content grows and changes, our design and our system will hold up. So performance, progression, proportion, and polish. We've talked about all that stuff. You can find out a lot more about it if you want to take a look at this. Anybody that's participating here and wants to get in touch with me after the fact, there may be some discount codes hanging around if anybody wants to grab the copy of the book. It's out as an early release right now, meaning it's not fully edited yet, but it means you can get it a little bit cheaper, and then you'll be notified when the full release is ready, and that should be within the next month to month and a half. And that's for the ebook version. The print version will be out in a little while. So that's the slides that I have. You can, if you go to this bit.ly link, JPFIL type, that one will take you to a version of these slides that's a little bit more complete from the Future Insights Conference in Las Vegas a few weeks ago. And with that, I will stop talking at you and start talking with you. So I hope that was helpful for everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. Really appreciate this. So guys, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask Jason.
So I know, I mean, we still have a few that were sent in ahead of time. And I know one of the things we haven't really talked about that much is how to choose typefaces. So speak up. Yeah. Let me know what you want to talk about.
Yeah, that's. I would be interested in hearing anything you have to say about choosing typefaces, and I guess sort of the feel that you create with the typefaces that you choose, and maybe anything about matching different typefaces, just like general parameters or structure that you use when setting out on a project?
Sure. Well, it's certainly something that we could devote days to, but in general, there's a few tips that I always recommend for people to start with, and one is in researching and understanding the project that you're working on, if there is any kind of a hook there, if it's a French company, look up French type designers. If it's related to a certain period in time, look up typefaces that came from that period in time, because they will help evoke a mood. And that's one of the most wonderful things about type, is not only does it convey the meaning of the words that it represents, but it also can help convey a mood. And if I say Western, you're going to think of letters in a Western poster. And if I say jazz, you're going to think of things that are kind of relevant that way. And there's these letter styles that are kind of ingrained in us, and those might be a bit of a cliche, but that should get you going in the right direction. So I tend to start with looking up type designers that worked in a time period that is relevant to the thing that I'm working on. Barring that, if you're working on something that's very modern, one of the things you can do is try looking at the blogs from all the different type services. So go to Typekit's blog, go to FontDeck's blog, go to fonts.com's blog, and they all have these galleries, and you can check out a lot of really modern designs and just sort of get a feel and start to think about what kind of a mood you feel when you look at them. And that can be really helpful just to get you going in the right direction. Generally speaking, sans serif typefaces render really well on screens most of the time. And again, these are caveats, but they're not absolutes. But the older the screen, the worse the rendering is going to be. So if your audience tends to be a lot of older IE users, if you're working on corporate intranets, things like that, testing is going to be really critical, and you want to keep with simple letter forms that aren't really overly complex so that they'll draw quickly and easily and readably. But if you're really working on modern stuff, then you have a lot more freedom. There's no reason to not try a serif font, one with the little feet on it, that like Georgia, that would look really beautiful and could be a really nice readable typeface on a small screen. There are so many emulators and devices out there that you can play with. It really pays to just try things out, and a lot of the services have free accounts, so you can do just that. You can also try out a service called Typecast, and that lets you pick web fonts from a bunch of different services. But I don't want to not answer the bit about pairing them, though, because I think that is an important thing to consider. Some typefaces come with a really broad range of weights. So if you look at something like Fura Sans is a beautiful example. It was designed for the Firefox OS. It's got something like 16 different weights and variants from extra light to extra heavy. So that's got a really fantastic range that you can use. So you could actually use one typeface and do your whole project with just that one typeface, and just use all the different weights and styles of it to give all the differentiation that you need. And that can be really successful sometimes. Another example is like Museo is a typeface that's been really popular since Typekit launched a few years ago. And it's a great typeface, and a lot of people still use it. I actually just used it on a project that launched today. And there are 3 different kinds of Museo. There's Museo Sans, which is a sans serif, and then there's Museo Slab, which has these really heavy serifs on it. And using those things in combination with lots of weights to them is really fantastic, and that way they'll all belong together because they're all drawn that way. But another real nifty trick is to look up typefaces that are drawn by the same person. So if you're looking at fonts.com, you could look things up by designer, and FontDeck, you can do the same thing. So even though they might not be technically related typefaces, when they're drawn by the same hand, oftentimes they'll have a nice relationship to them. So a really good example of that is Avant-Garde and Lublin Graph. Both drawn by Herb Lublin. One is a sans serif, one is a slab serif, but even though they were drawn at very different times, they look fantastic together. So looking by designer is another interesting way for you to find typefaces that will work well together.
Cool, that's great. Thank you.
Sure.
If I get maybe a follow-up question on that, do you know of any resources that you recommend that are sort of like just introductory to fonts? I'm kind of like have been more of a developer, but doing more work on the front end, and might have decisions coming up in the future about more on design. So
yeah. Robert Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style is a fantastic book. That may be a little bit off the path for what you need in the shorter term. Mm-hmm. It's still a great reference, but another one that you might want to look at is a couple of books by Ellen Lupton, and those are Thinking with Type, and there's a new edition that just came out, and that's a fantastic book. It's used as a textbook in a ton of graphic design programs, and it's really, really well written. And then she also wrote one recently for Type on Screen, and so looking at her books is a really great resource. Jason Santamaria is another fantastic designer who has a book coming out on web typography. from a book apart. And we've actually kind of gone back and forth a little bit about our books. I have a little bit more of a technical approach in mind. I spend a lot more time focusing on the implementation and how to do that well, and he focuses a little bit more on aesthetics. So his might be a really great example, although that's not out yet, so I don't know for sure, but he's a pretty amazing designer and he's a great writer. So I can only imagine that it's probably going to be really, really good.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. So Ronnie had a question in the chat window about glyph fonts. Are you meaning icon fonts? Is that what you were asking about? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think icon fonts are pretty awesome. I really like working with them a lot, and you know, I think that in most cases that's totally fine. There is one major drawback about them, though. So an icon font is really just like any other font that you might be using, but it's just made up literally of icons, and they might be social media stuff. They might be icons of your own design. They could be all sorts of things, they're really awesome, and they're a great way to provide resolution-independent graphic assets to your site. So that they'll look great on Retina displays and everything else. The thing that you have to watch out for is there's no good fallback. So if the web font doesn't load, there's just nothing there. So while I still use them, it's because I haven't gotten my act together enough to try Grunticon, and so that is something from the Filament group that they created in order to let you take SVG graphics and create PNG fallbacks and the CSS to use them. So that way you could have all of these icons that work in a resolution-independent manner just using SVG, and then still have PNG there as a fallback for devices that don't understand SVG, which is a pretty small percentage these days. And so the reason that I think this is important and worth thinking about is that there's always a point in time when the web font's not loaded. So there's always going to be a point in time during that load process when your icons aren't there, and if there's no good fallback, people have no idea what those things are. So they don't know that it's a link to your Facebook profile. They don't know that it's elements that are supposed to guide you through the UI and indicate that this is a list of articles. So it is worth thinking about. And then you also have to consider that if you have a very international audience, there are tons of devices, 350 million of them or so, that are using Opera Mini that doesn't support icon fonts or any kind of web font at all. So that is kind of a big problem if you work on an international site that has a ton of traffic from areas of Africa or India or Asia. So that is something to think about. You know, I think if you have a largely sort of US-centric audience, then maybe that's fine. I know I rely on it. If you use Modernizer built into your code, then you can do a bunch of feature detects and find out if web fonts will be supported. So hopefully that'll answer your question there. But you know, I think in general, you can probably say, sure, I'm going to use web fonts because they're going to be, or icon fonts rather, because they're supported pretty much anywhere, unless you fall into that category of I deal with a lot of people with slow network connections and using really low capability handsets that need to get all of this stuff right away. And then take a look at Grunticon from the Filament group, and that will give you an easy way to go around that and use SVG instead. So hopefully that answers your questions there, Ronnie. The next question here in the sidebar is from, I'm sorry, is Aloki? I don't know, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Asking about using the same font for headings and body copy. I generally don't. I like the contrast. So that is one of the sort of fairly standard conventions in typographic design, to have something that gives you a little bit of contrast and draws a little more attention to itself. So you might use a heavier serif typeface for your headings, and then have a sans serif that works nicely with it on in the body copy. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this site that I just launched today. Hang on one second. Just gotta let that load. And just to show you what that looks like. It's not really pulling up right now, so we're going to probably come back to that. But generally speaking, the idea is to have a heading that works nicely and has a relationship to the body copy, but maybe has a little bit more presence to it. So through scale and also just the general style gives you a little bit more oomph in those headings to help set them apart. Anybody have any other questions they want to ask, or any other code bits or anything else people want to see?
Yeah, Jason, I think have you had a chance to cover Ronnie's second question about?
Which about whether or not the glyph fonts will work?
Yes.
So I did, but let me sort of be more clear about that. I often use Modernizer. Well, often, I really use it all the time, as part of how I build up the page. And Modernizer is a great JavaScript library that does a bunch of detections and lets you know exactly what's supported in the browser by injecting classes. So that's putting it in the chat window. It's just modernizer.com. And excuse me. And what that will allow, or what it will do for you, is we'll inject all these classes in there, and it'll tell you all the things that are supported. So when I have this running on this other site that I was going to show you, it tells me that Flexbox is supported, Canvas is supported, WebGL, geolocation, index, DDB, hash change, history, drag and drop, all these different HTML5 things, and it also indicates that font face is supported. So if you look for the presence of that class, then you know that that font face is supported and it's safe to load that. So it is possible. Now, you have to bear in mind that if JavaScript isn't supported, then you don't get any of these things. And the absence of JavaScript does not necessarily mean the absence of that font face support. So you have to weigh that and decide how you want to proceed. When you can't know that it's supported, do you want to still try? So there was another one in here, and this was about this landing page, and I would have to say, I don't know if everybody else is looking at the link there. There's not really a whole lot to this page, so I mean, in terms of making it responsive, it kind of almost is. I mean, if basically you could do this whole thing with a maximum width, and that seems to be kind of what's been done. So I can imagine that working pretty well on a small screen. So I'm not really quite sure what the question is with that. I don't. Did the person who asked that question, are they here? Richard Burton.
Right. Yeah, I don't think Richard was able to come here today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess if he has any follow-up questions, I'll perhaps try to make an intro.
Yeah, sure. That's totally fine. I mean, it's it's a very straightforward little page, so there's not really a ton to it. So it would be I think pretty easy to work with that. So one of the things I thought I'd do also is I'm going to put in here so that should link over to the code repository that I have for there it is, for the responsive design workshops that I teach. And if you grab the source code from there, there's 3 different type lessons that has a lot of the stuff that I talked about here. So it's already in some pages with just basic vanilla CSS, so you can like look through that and not have to worry about having any preprocessor installed or anything like that. So all that stuff there has lots of comments in it too. It should be pretty easy to follow. So feel free to send that link out to anybody else who's interested.
Great, awesome, thank you. Do
Sure.
we have any other follow-up questions? Brian, Ronnie?
No, I was kind of just looking for a general introduction, get my brain spinning on this stuff a little bit, and I think this was exactly what I was looking for, so it was good.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear it. So what kind of work are you doing?
As a web application developer, and so I've done most of my work on the server side. I've been doing this for a little over 2 years, and have wanted to move my way more towards the front end, and kind of want to be a developer with a good eye for design. I don't know if I ever see myself as a developer, but and I have an opportunity sort of at our company right now. Our front-end developer left, and we're going to be in transition for a while, so I might be able to spend some time working on more front-end stuff, so just trying to immerse myself into as much as I can. I feel like there's a, I don't know if it's the 80-20 rule or low-hanging fruit or whatever, but I know that there's probably a lot of stuff out there that, or a lot of things that I can do to make myself a lot better in those decisions that I make without having to, fully become a designer. So trying to do that.
Well, that's, I think that there's a real opportunity with developing a greater sensitivity with type, because it actually can impact so much of the project with only a small number of choices. So really focusing on getting to know how to select and pair typefaces, and then play around with all the source code from the repo that I posted, and it'll really help you get around a lot of the implementation issues and get things loading quickly, which is one of the biggest complaints that people have, and smoothing the transition from using the fallback fonts being displayed to the web fonts finally loading. If you can nail those things and really work to finesse them, then you'll be sort of head and shoulders above what most people are doing. I mean, I still get questions, even today from people that have worked on really, really big projects that don't really think about these techniques, and all they do is complain about web fonts ruining the experience, and they don't have to. They can really add to it, and you can mitigate a lot of these other issues very easily.
So this repository and the workshop outlined here, is it primarily around performance stuff that you talked about, or is it sort of just a bigger version of the stuff that you touched on today?
Well, so that repo actually contains all of the stuff for a full-day workshop that I teach on responsive design, but there's 3 lessons in there, advanced type 1, 2, and 3, that amongst all of those kind of combines pretty much everything I talked about today. And it includes some web fonts that are already there, some icon font stuff, some of these fixes for the loading stuff, as well as adding in some of the nicer touches for your typography and how to access some of the open type features. And then, I mean, if you're interested, there's also a demo of picture fill in there and a few other things. So there's a bunch of useful things in there for front-end people working on responsive design.
Cool. So this is all code. I'm not missing any sort of walkthrough or like tutorial part or whatever. This is basically just implementation, best practice implementation of these different things.
Hey there. Sorry about that. I just got booted.
Oh. You're back?
Yeah, I think I'm back now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you're like stuck in, well, there's 2 of you.
Well, hopefully my other self won't pipe up.
Okay. Yeah, okay. That's good. No, I was just kind of thinking out loud as I look through this repository here. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully there's some other helpful stuff in there for you too. But primarily, the main thing was just to point you to the stuff to play with all the things I was talking about today. I mean, obviously I'd love to have you buy the book, but you don't really need to get all that stuff out of it.
Yeah, and your book is it's all focused on responsive typefaces. Is that right?
It's everything that I've ever learned about using web fonts.
Okay.
So there is some stuff in there about the history of type on the web and a little bit about how type goes together and when you should start thinking about it during the design process. There's tons of tips in there about how to get it to work well on different platforms, some things to try when it's not working well in IE, and then along with the edits that I've been making the last couple weeks, I have a little bit of news to include on responsive type and web fonts in email, although that is still really largely unsupported, but at least it's getting better.
Cool.
So that's that you can find on the O'Reilly website under their early releases, or
I'll bookmark that. You have a link there?
So yeah,
Oh,
that's a link to the O'Reilly page.
Cool.
Great. So, do we have any other questions for Jason? So I guess that's about it. So yeah, thank you, Jason. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And Brian and Ronnie, thanks for all your questions. If you guys are interested, follow me on Twitter, and I'll send you guys some discount codes for the book if you want them.
Cool.
All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Jason.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.